Good evening and welcome back to Mystic Nightfall. Tonight, we venture into the darkness that lies beneath the earth, into a realm that both fascinated and terrified the ancient Greeks in equal measure. We're exploring the underworld, or as they called it, Hades, the kingdom of the dead, where every soul, hero, and slave, king and beggar, would eventually find their final destination. For the Greeks, death was never merely an ending. It was a transition, a journey, a fundamental aspect of cosmic order that demanded respect, ritual, and proper ceremony. The ancient Greeks didn't fear death itself so much as they feared dying improperly, of being forgotten, of wandering in darkness with no coin for passage and no one to pour libations in their name. This fear shaped their entire civilization, from the grandest temples to the smallest coin placed in a dead person's mouth. But here's what's fascinating. The Greek underworld wasn't a single place. It wasn't hell, despite what later Christian interpretations would suggest. It was far more nuanced, far more complex than that. It was a realm of justice where your deeds determined your fate. It was a place of memory and forgetting, of torture and bliss, of eternal consciousness and eventual oblivion. And at its heart was a god who, unlike the violent, passionate deities of Olympus, ruled with stern impartiality, never breaking his laws, never bending to emotion. The ancient Greeks believed in this underworld not as metaphor, but as absolute reality. They could describe its geography with geographical precision. They knew the names of its rivers, the identities of its judges, the faces of its inhabitants. They heard stories of heroes who had journeyed there and returned. They visited oracles where they could supposedly speak to the dead. And through it all, they crafted an intricate philosophy of death that would influence Western thought for millennia. Tonight, we descend into that darkness together. Let us walk the shores of the river Styx, pass by the three-headed guardian, stand before the judges, and understand how the Greeks, in all their wisdom and wonder, conceived of that final journey we all must take. But first, settle deeper into your rest, for the underworld awaits. And it is a journey best taken with quiet contemplation and a clear mind. Beneath the earth, in layers so deep that no sunlight could ever reach them, lay the kingdom of Hades. Not beneath the soil, in the way we might understand it now, but in a different dimension altogether, accessible only through certain thresholds, certain thin places where the living world and the dead world met. The ancient Greeks imagined it as a vast, interconnected realm with distinct regions, each with its own purpose and character, all held within a geography as detailed and mapped as any mortal kingdom. The first thing to understand about the underworld is that it was bounded by 5 rivers, each one serving a specific purpose in the architecture of the afterlife. These weren't merely water features. They were cosmic boundaries, spiritual thresholds that defined the nature of the underworld itself. The river Styx was the most famous and most significant, the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, the river that Charon the ferryman would cross with his passengers. To cross the Styx was to leave the living world forever, to sever the final connection to mortality. But there was also the river Acheron, the river of sorrow, which flowed through the underworld itself and was said to be the most prominent of the internal rivers. This was where the dead arrived first, where they presented themselves to Charon, where those without coins were condemned to wander for 100 years, crying and lamenting their fate. The Greeks understood this not as poetic language, but as literal truth. A soul without payment could not cross, and the thought of such abandonment was so horrifying that even the poorest mortals were buried with some coin, some way to pay their passage. There was the river Phlegethon, the river of fire, where violence dwelt in a very real and tangible form. Then came the river Cocytus, the river of lamentation, where the sounds of weeping and regret seemed to flow like water itself. And finally, there was the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, the water of oblivion that would wash away all memory of earthly life. For those souls destined to be reborn, it was essential to drink from Lethe, for without forgetting their past lives, how could they be reborn fresh into new bodies? Yet for others, the very thought of Lethe was terrifying. The idea that everything they had been, everything they had done, all their loves and struggles, would be erased forever into a kind of oblivion. These 5 rivers didn't flow in a way that logic would suggest. They crisscrossed through the underworld, flowing around it, meeting at certain points. There was supposedly a place called the Stygian Marsh where all the main rivers converged. Some sources mention an Acherusian lake into which the Acheron flowed while the Styx and Phlegethon encircled it. The exact geography was fluid and debated even among the ancient Greeks themselves, but the idea was consistent. The underworld was defined by water, by boundaries that marked different regions and different spiritual states. From these rivers, one could map out the major realms of the afterlife. At the top, closest to the land of the living, lay the asphodel meadows, the gray plains where the vast majority of souls drifted in a kind of twilight existence. This was neither reward nor punishment, but simply the default state for ordinary people, those who had been neither especially virtuous nor especially wicked. The asphodel meadows were described as being somewhat like a very dull version of the living world, where souls could walk and talk, but without passion, without joy, without the warmth that makes life worth living. The poet Homer, himself describing these meadows through the words of the ghost of Achilles, seemed to suggest that even the greatest of mortal heroes would prefer a single day of life on earth as the poorest slave to an eternity as a king in the asphodel meadows. Beyond the asphodel meadows, accessible to those who had lived with genuine virtue and honor, lay the Elysian fields, often called Elysium. This was the reward, the paradise, the place where heroes dwelt and where the virtuous lived in eternal contentment. The Elysian fields were described with language of perpetual spring, of constant sunshine, of perfect weather and perfect peace. There was no suffering there, no old age, no disease. The dead who dwelt in Elysium were said to remember their lives on earth, unlike those in Asphodel who drank from Lethe and forgot, and they were comforted by that remembrance, knowing they had earned their rest. But there was another realm, the one that truly terrified the Greeks, Tartarus. Tartarus wasn't merely a place of punishment in the abstract sense. It was conceived of as a pit, an abyss so deep that it was said to lie as far below the earth as the earth lay below the heavens. It was a place of active, intentional torment, where the universe itself seemed configured to cause suffering. The most wicked souls, those who had committed crimes of cosmic significance, who had violated sacred oaths, who had harmed guests or family, who had defied the gods themselves, were sent to Tartarus to endure punishments that were specifically tailored to their crimes. What made Tartarus different from mere earthly suffering was its eternal nature. On earth, a criminal's punishment would end with death. But in Tartarus, death itself had already occurred, and from that point onward, the punishment continued without relief, without hope of redemption, without any possibility of end. Some of the most famous inhabitants of Tartarus had been there for ages beyond reckoning. Prometheus, the Titan who stole fire for humanity, hung chained to a rock while an eagle feasted on his liver, and his liver would regrow each night, only for the torture to begin anew each day. Sisyphus rolled his boulder up a hill for eternity, watching it roll back down eternally. Tantalus stood in water that receded from his lips whenever he tried to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches rose out of his reach whenever he tried to eat. These weren't random torments or symbolic punishments. Each one was carefully designed to mirror the crime, to embody the nature of the offense. A man who had violated hospitality would starve and thirst forever. A man who had taken what wasn't his would find everything just beyond his reach. A man who had killed guests at his home would roll a stone forever, never finding rest. The Greeks understood the underworld as a place where cosmic justice operated with perfect precision, where the laws of morality weren't mere suggestions but fundamental rules that, once violated, triggered consequences as inevitable as gravity. The ruler of all this, Hades himself, dwelt in a palace somewhere in the depths of the underworld. His palace was imagined to be similar in splendor to the halls of Olympus, but inverted, built of dark stone rather than gleaming marble, lit by torchlight rather than starlight. Here, the god of the dead maintained his court, with Persephone beside him as his queen, and the dead passing through for judgment according to laws that never changed and never failed. What made the Greek conception of the underworld unique was its moral structure. It wasn't a place of random chaos or demonic cruelty. It was a realm governed by justice, by order, by the principle that deeds on earth had consequences in the afterlife. The underworld wasn't designed to be cruel for cruelty's sake. It was designed to maintain cosmic balance, to ensure that justice prevailed even after death, to guarantee that the universe operated according to rational principles rather than the whims of tyrants. In many ways, the Greek underworld represented an ideal of justice that the living world couldn't always achieve: perfect, impartial, thorough, and eternal. When we speak of the underworld, we must speak of Hades, and to understand Hades is to understand something rarely found in Greek mythology: a god who was both powerful and humble, terrible and just, feared yet never truly hated. Hades was one of the 12 Olympian deities, one of the 6 children born to Kronos and Rhea during the reign of the Titans. When his brother Zeus led the rebellion against their father and emerged victorious, Kronos' 3 surviving sons, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, cast lots to divide the universe among themselves. The story goes that they threw the bones onto the ground and let fate decide their domains. Zeus won the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, and Hades received the underworld. Some have suggested that this lottery was rigged, that Hades received what no god truly wanted, the realm of death and darkness, while his brothers received the light and motion of the heavens and seas. But Hades, in the Greek conception, never complained. He took his realm and ruled it with an authority that matched that of his brothers, but he did so in solitude, in isolation, rarely leaving his dark kingdom to visit Mount Olympus, where the other gods gathered in light and laughter. This isolation was crucial to who Hades was. While Zeus had countless affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women, generating demigods and drama across the known world, Hades remained faithful to a single wife. While Poseidon would emerge from his oceans to meddle in mortal affairs, creating sea monsters and disasters, Hades maintained his realm with quiet consistency. He was not a god of passion, but of principle, not a god of violence, but of order. The Greeks respected him for this, even as they feared him, because his consistency made sense of the world. The one thing you could count on was that Hades would be fair, that the rules of his realm would be maintained, that what was promised would be delivered. When the Greeks spoke of Hades, they often used the name reluctantly, for there was a superstition against calling the name of the Lord of the Dead too casually. Instead, they referred to him as Pluton, meaning the wealthy one, for all treasures hidden in the earth, the metals, the gems, the precious stones, were his domain as Lord of everything beneath the earth. They also called him the infernal Zeus, or Zeus of the lower world, acknowledging that while his power was of a different sort than his brothers, it was no less absolute. A thunderbolt from Zeus might kill you instantly, but Hades would receive your shade and govern your eternity, and in a sense, that governance was more significant than any moment of death. The fear associated with Hades wasn't the visceral terror of a tyrant. It was something deeper, something closer to dread or awe. The Greeks feared Hades the way one fears gravity or the laws of nature, as something inevitable and powerful that cannot be negotiated with or overcome through cunning or bravery. When people made sacrifices to Hades, they did so quietly, often with their eyes downcast, asking not for blessings, but for mercy, for fair judgment, for the god's terrible fairness to be applied to their case. And then there was Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and her presence transformed everything we understand about Hades and about the realm itself. The story of Persephone's abduction by Hades is among the most famous of all Greek myths, and it appears in numerous versions, each with slightly different implications. In the most common version, Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of harvest, and Zeus, the king of gods, was gathering flowers in a meadow when Hades, who had fallen desperately in love with her, opened the earth beneath her feet and pulled her down into his kingdom. Demeter, mad with grief, searched everywhere for her daughter, neglecting her duties as goddess of the harvest. The earth became barren, crops failed, famine spread across the land. Neither mortals nor immortals could persuade her to end her mourning because she refused to stop until her daughter was returned. Zeus, recognizing that the world would collapse if this went on much longer, sent Hermes to negotiate with Hades. And here is where the story becomes complex and interesting, because Hades agreed to release Persephone on one condition. She had eaten pomegranate seeds in his realm, fruit of the underworld, and because she had consumed food of the dead, she was bound to him. What resulted was a compromise, orchestrated by Zeus, that became the explanation for the seasons. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother on Earth, where the world bloomed in spring and summer, but she would spend the other part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and during those months, fall and winter, Demeter would grieve and the world would become cold and barren. It was a myth that explained the changing seasons, but it also revealed something profound about the nature of death and life, about how they were intertwined, how the cycle of growth and decay, of life and death, was fundamental to existence. Over time, Persephone's role in the underworld became more complex than that of a mere captive or victim. She became the queen of the underworld, a true partner to Hades in the governance of the realm. Unlike Zeus's various loves, who bore him children and were often cast aside, Persephone held her position and her dignity. She had authority over the dead in her own right, and we see in various myths that she was capable of making decisions independent of Hades, of granting or withholding permission, of wielding real power. In many myths, when heroes journeyed to the underworld, it was Persephone rather than Hades who held the key to their success. Orpheus, who journeyed to retrieve his beloved Eurydice, played music so beautiful that both Hades and Persephone wept. But it was Persephone who granted the permission for Eurydice to return, on the condition that Orpheus not look back. When Heracles needed to bring Cerberus to the surface world, it was through the favor of Persephone that he gained the right to do so. She appeared in myths as wise, sometimes merciful, sometimes stern, but always as a figure of genuine authority. This made the underworld unique in Greek mythology. It wasn't ruled by a tyrant who could be charmed or bribed. It was ruled by a pair, a god and a goddess, who maintained their realm according to principles, not whims. And there's something almost romantic about their relationship, if one chooses to read it that way. Hades, isolated in his dark kingdom, had fallen in love with a young goddess of spring. Whether her feelings gradually changed from fear to love, whether she came to appreciate his consistency and justice after the chaos of Mount Olympus, whether she came to genuinely enjoy her role as queen of half the year and half the cosmos. The myths suggest something more complex than simple captivity. Demeter herself, according to some sources, eventually came to tolerate, if not accept, this arrangement. She visited her daughter in the underworld. She made peace with Hades. The myth that began with violation and grief ended with a kind of balance, with the acknowledgement that death and life, darkness and light, winter and spring, were not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. The underworld, under the rule of Hades and Persephone, became a realm where things operated according to justice and balance, where even sorrow was understood as having its necessary place in the cosmic order. In the moment of death, according to Greek belief, something profound happened that was both physical and mystical. The psyche, often translated as the soul, but perhaps better understood as the spirit or the essential self, left the body like a breath of wind, like a final exhalation. This wasn't a violent rupture or a moment of transcendence. It was more like the last puff of air leaving a room when a window opens, quiet and inevitable. The moment this happened, the person was dead, and their journey to the underworld had begun. The dead person's body was left behind, now merely an empty vessel, and the family and loved ones began the rituals that would ensure the psyche had proper passage. But the psyche itself, invisible and weightless, would be met almost immediately by Hermes Psychopompos. Hermes, the guide of souls. Hermes wore his winged sandals and carried his caduceus, his staff of office, and his job was to lead the dead to the underworld, to guide them from the upper world to the realm below. Sometimes Hermes led a soul alone. Sometimes, if many people died at once, he would lead a whole company of the dead, gathering them like a shepherd gathers sheep. For those with family, those who had been properly buried with ceremony, The journey would begin with the funeral itself, the sacred rituals that prepared them for their passage. But even before that, at the moment of death, the journey had already begun in the spiritual sense. The psyche, newly separated from the body, was in a vulnerable state, caught between worlds. This is why the Greeks considered it so important that the body be treated with respect, that the rituals begin immediately. The living had to act quickly to ensure the dead had proper passage, because the dead themselves could not do this alone. What followed was a journey that took the soul across the landscape of the underworld, a journey that was described in various ways by different sources, but which generally followed this pattern. The soul, guided by Hermes, would descend into the underworld, moving through the earth itself or through some kind of passage that existed parallel to the earth. At the boundary of the living world and the dead world stood the river Acheron, the river of sorrow, and here the first great test awaited. Charon the ferryman stood at the banks of this river in his simple boat, and he would agree to transport a soul across only if that soul could pay him with an obol, a small coin. Charon was not a sympathetic figure. He was stern, grim, often depicted as ancient and weary, as if he had been ferrying souls since the beginning of time and was tired of the work. His boat was simple, made of wood, powered by a long oar that he poled along the river bottom. He didn't welcome his passengers or speak kindly to them. He simply required payment, and if they couldn't pay, he would not ferry them. Those without coins would be left to wander the banks of the Acheron for 100 years, crying and lamenting their fate, unable to move forward, trapped in a kind of limbo between the worlds. This is why the custom of placing a coin in the mouth of the dead was so crucial to Greek burial practice. Even the poorest families would struggle to provide this coin because the alternative, an eternity of wandering at the river's edge, unable to move forward or back, unable to rest or find peace, was simply too horrible to contemplate. The obol wasn't a fee imposed by a mercenary or a greedy spirit. It was understood as a kind of necessity, a balance that had to be paid to maintain the structure of the cosmos itself. It was the same principle that governed the operation of mills or ferries in the living world. They required payment because transport required effort and resources, and even Charon had to be sustained. Once Charon had ferried a soul across the Acheron, or sometimes souls crossed other rivers in different accounts, they faced their next great obstacle, Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. Cerberus was described in various ways by different sources. Most commonly, he was depicted as possessing 3 canine heads, though some sources gave him up to 100 heads, or a mixture of dog and serpent heads. What was consistent in all descriptions was that he was enormous, terrifying, and that he served a specific function. He allowed the dead to enter the underworld, but permitted no one to leave. He was the guardian of the gate, the enforcer of the boundary between the land of the dead and any possibility of return. Cerberus was the offspring of Typhon, the fire-breathing giant, and Echidna, the half-woman, half-serpent, and his siblings included the Hydra and the Chimera, all monstrous creatures. He had a serpentine tail and was covered with snakes, particularly around his mane, and he ate only live meat. He was, in every sense, a monster, designed by nature to be terrifying, to inspire dread and submission in all who approached. And yet, like everything in the Greek underworld, there was a logic to his monstrosity. He wasn't cruel for the sake of it. He was the perfect enforcer of boundaries because his very nature inspired obedience. Interestingly, Cerberus was not generally hostile to the dead. They were, after all, his charges, and they had nowhere else to go anyway. His fury was reserved for the living who dared to approach his domain, or for those souls who might attempt escape. For the dead arriving at the gate, he would stand aside, though his presence was always intimidating, always a reminder that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. Beyond Cerberus lay the plains of Asphodel, the great meadow where most souls would find themselves wandering. But not all souls remained there forever. Those who had lived with particular virtue, or those who had been specially blessed by the gods, would be guided further into the underworld, toward the hall of judgment where the three judges waited. Those souls who arrived at the judges' hall would be led forward by Hermes, or sometimes by other divine guides, and they would stand before three beings who had once been mortal themselves, but who now, in death, had been elevated to the rank of divine judges: Minos, Aeacus, and Rhadamanthus. The journey of the dead, then, was not merely a spatial displacement, but a process of judgment and evaluation. A soul moved through space, from death to river to gate to plain to judgment. But each step of that physical journey corresponded to a spiritual state. The body was left behind, the psyche descended, the psyche paid its passage, the psyche acknowledged the boundary between worlds by facing Cerberus, and finally, the psyche received judgment and was assigned its eternal dwelling place. It was a journey that every Greek expected to take, that every Greek feared taking, and that every Greek prepared for throughout their lives by living according to virtue, by making sure their burial rites would be performed, by ensuring they would have a coin to pay the ferryman. At the heart of the Greek conception of the underworld lay the principle that death was not an escape from judgment. It was, rather, the beginning of the most important judgment of all. In the living world, justice could be delayed, corrupted, or escaped. The wealthy could bribe judges. The powerful could evade consequences. The clever could hide their crimes. But in the underworld, under the jurisdiction of Hades and Persephone, justice operated with perfect consistency and perfect impartiality, and it was administered by three judges who had been chosen by Zeus himself to weigh every soul and determine its eternal fate. The first of these judges was Minos, and his name resonates through Greek history as a great king, the legendary ruler of Crete in the Age of Heroes. According to myth, Minos had been known for his justice, even in life, and when he died, Zeus himself appointed him to judge the souls of the dead. Minos was given particular authority in cases where his fellow judges disagreed, making him in some sense the chief judge, though all three held equal authority in the normal course of events. The second judge was Rhadamanthus, another figure from antiquity, another son of Zeus, another legendary king known for his wisdom and justice during his mortal reign. Rhadamanthus was traditionally said to judge the souls from Asia, bringing the standards of justice he had known in life to the realm of death, applying those standards to every soul that passed before him. The third judge was Aeacus, again a figure from the heroic age, again a king known for his justice, again a son of Zeus elevated to divine status after death. Aeacus was said to judge the souls from Europe, and there were some accounts that gave him a special role in overseeing the gates of Tartarus itself, standing as a kind of guardian not just of the entry to the underworld, but of the deepest pits where the worst criminals were confined. These three men, all of whom had lived on earth and had known the complexities of justice in The mortal world were believed to understand something that purely divine judges might not: the struggles that mortals faced, the temptations they encountered, the circumstances that complicated every moral choice. They had been rulers, and they had had to make difficult decisions about guilt and innocence. They had lived according to virtue and had been rewarded by Zeus with eternal authority. Their appointment as judges suggested that the underworld operated according to a principle: justice is best administered by those who have lived justly and who understand the complexity of human nature. The judgment process itself was imagined in various ways by different sources, but the most common description involved the judges weighing the soul of the deceased. In some accounts, they literally used scales, placing the soul on one side and the sum of their deeds on the other, watching to see whether justice balanced or tipped to one side. In other accounts, they questioned the dead, hearing testimony about their life, their actions, their choices. In still others, they seemed to operate through a kind of intuitive understanding, looking at a soul and immediately knowing its worth and its deserts. The criteria for judgment were clear and consistent. The judges looked at how one had lived, whether one had honored the gods, whether one had treated guests and family members with respect, whether one had broken oaths, whether one had committed murder or violated hospitality, whether one had lived justly according to one's station and abilities. Virtue was understood not as abstract moral perfection, but as proper action within one's role and circumstances. A slave could be judged as virtuous if they served faithfully and without complaint. A king could be judged as wicked if they ruled unjustly despite their power. A warrior could be honored if they died bravely in battle. A merchant could be condemned if they cheated their customers. What's particularly striking about the Greek conception of judgment is that it included no possibility of appeal, no court of higher authority, no petition for mercy, except insofar as the judge themselves chose to show compassion. The judges were final. Their decision was eternal. This wasn't a harsh principle when applied to those who had lived well. It meant that their virtue was recognized absolutely, eternally, without qualification. But it meant that those who had lived wickedly faced absolute condemnation with no hope of reversal. This created a kind of pressure on the living to ensure they lived rightly, because death didn't erase or forgive anything. Every deed was recorded, every wrong was remembered, every oath was binding. The Greeks understood their society through this lens. If you knew that your every action would be weighed and judged eternally, you might be inclined to treat others with more respect, to honor your commitments, to think twice before breaking the laws of hospitality or committing violence. The judge's role also suggested that the underworld was a place of order and reason, not of arbitrary punishment. The punishments assigned to the wicked in Tartarus weren't sadistic cruelties thought up by a petty tyrant. They were carefully reasoned responses to specific crimes, assigned by wise judges who understood the proportionality of punishment. A murderer received one form of torment, an oath-breaker another, a violator of hospitality yet another. The punishment fit the crime because the judges who assigned it had thought deeply about justice. Beneath Asphodel, deeper than the realm where the dead simply existed in gray forgetfulness, lay Tartarus, the pit, the abyss, the place of torment. If Elysium was the Greek conception of paradise, then Tartarus was their conception of hell, though with important differences from later Christian conceptions. Tartarus wasn't ruled by a demonic figure or by evil forces. It was an extension of the divine justice system, administered by the gods themselves, with Hades and Persephone overseeing it as they oversaw all the underworld. The torments experienced in Tartarus weren't the work of malevolent creatures seeking to cause suffering for its own sake. They were the logical consequences of moral failure, administered by judges who understood that some crimes demanded eternal punishment. The depth of Tartarus was itself almost incomprehensible. The myths described it as lying as far below the earth as the earth lay below the heavens, a kind of cosmic emphasis on how remote and inaccessible it was, how thoroughly separated from the living world. If it took all day for the sun to traverse the sky, then it would take all night for something to fall from the surface of the earth to the bottom of Tartarus. It was a distance that emphasized the totality of the separation, the utter finality of condemnation to that place. The most famous inhabitants of Tartarus were those whose crimes had been so significant that they became legendary, whose punishments embodied philosophical principles about the consequences of hubris and wickedness. Consider Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, who had committed numerous crimes against the natural and divine order. He had murdered guests who came to him seeking hospitality, violating one of the most sacred laws of Greek society. He had used his cleverness to cheat both mortals and gods, seducing his niece, revealing divine secrets, even managing to trick Thanatos himself into chains so that death disappeared from the earth. When Zeus finally condemned him, the punishment devised was eternal and perfectly suited to his crime. Sisyphus was forced to roll an enormous boulder up a steep hill, and every time he neared the top, exhausted from his effort, the boulder would roll back down, and he would have to begin again, and again, and again, forever. What makes the Sisyphus punishment so psychologically devastating in the myth is that it's not random cruelty. It's a perfect embodiment of futility, of endless struggle that accomplishes nothing, of being trapped in a cycle where effort brings no reward and progress is impossible. For a man whose crime was his refusal to accept limits and laws, the punishment was eternal limitlessness, but of a kind that made the limitlessness itself a form of imprisonment, where the one thing he could not do was escape. Then there was Tantalus, a king whose crime was different but equally egregious. Tantalus had killed his own son and served the child's flesh as a meal to the gods, trying to trick them into eating human flesh. He had also stolen ambrosia, the food of the gods, and had revealed divine secrets to mortals. His punishment, like Sisyphus's, was perfectly suited to his transgression. He was placed in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, but whenever he bent down to drink, the water receded from his lips. When he reached up to pick the fruits hanging above him, the branches rose just out of his reach. He was tormented by the proximity of sustenance while being forever unable to obtain it. The very word tantalize in English comes from his name. To offer something that cannot be obtained. To tempt with something forever just beyond reach. For a man who had stolen divine food and divine secrets, the punishment was eternal hunger and thirst, eternal deprivation in the midst of apparent plenty. Ixion, another king condemned to Tartarus, had committed crimes of extraordinary arrogance. He had attempted to seduce Hera, wife of Zeus, and Zeus had stopped him by creating a cloud woman shaped like Hera and allowing Ixion to pursue it instead. But this wasn't the end of Ixion's crimes. He murdered his father-in-law and then boasted about it, claiming that the killing could never be avenged. For this combination of attempted divine seduction and braggadocio's murder, Ixion was punished by being bound to a fiery wheel that spun eternally through the air and eventually through Tartarus. Every revolution of the wheel was a reminder of his crime. Every moment of movement was agony. And unlike Sisyphus or Tantalus, Ixion couldn't even experience the illusion of progress or the possibility of variation. He simply spun, bound, and helpless, forever. What's striking about these punishments is that they aren't described as being inflicted by external agents, but as being inherent to the nature of the underworld itself. The boulder doesn't roll down a hill because someone pushes it. It's simply the nature of the hill and the situation that the boulder must roll down. The water doesn't recede because someone pulls it away. It's the nature of that particular water and that particular place that it behaves this way. The wheel doesn't spin because demons turn it. It spins as if by the nature of Tartarus itself. This suggests that the Greeks understood the underworld as a place where justice is built into the very structure of reality, where punishment is automatic and inevitable, where the cosmos itself enforces morality. There were many other inmates of Tartarus besides these three famous figures. The Titans themselves, Kronos and his siblings, were imprisoned there in bronze chambers guarded by the 100-handed giants, their punishment for their rebellion against Zeus. The Danaids, the 50 daughters of Danos, were condemned to fill a bottomless vessel with water, forever performing a task that could never be completed. Prometheus, the Titan who had stolen fire for humanity and who had dared to defy Zeus's authority, hung chained to a rock in Caucasus, which was sometimes placed in Tartarus, while an eagle descended each day to devour his liver, and each night it would grow back for the torment to be repeated. There were also ordinary mortals whose crimes had been so severe that they earned eternal punishment. Those who had committed murder, who had betrayed their families, who had broken sacred oaths, who had violated guest friendship, who had betrayed the gods, these could all find themselves in Tartarus if their crimes were deemed serious enough by the judges. The principle was consistent. The punishment fit the crime, and the punishment was eternal because the crime was understood to have violated something fundamental about the cosmic order. What the Greeks seemed to understand through the concept of Tartarus is that some crimes can't be forgiven, that some violations of the sacred order are so fundamental that they demand eternal consequences. This wasn't vindictiveness, but principle. If you allow someone who has violated the most sacred laws to eventually escape punishment, you undermine the reality of those laws. You make them suggestions rather than laws. By making the punishment eternal, the Greeks were emphasizing that certain principles, hospitality, family loyalty, respect for the gods, keeping one's oaths, were not negotiable. They were the foundations upon which society and cosmos alike were built, and to violate them was to place oneself outside the community of the just forever. On the opposite end of the spectrum from Tartarus lay Elysium, also called the Elysian Fields, also sometimes referred to as the Islands of the Blessed. If Tartarus was the Greek conception of what happened to the wicked, Elysium was the Greek conception of what happened to those who had lived with virtue, particularly those who had lived with exceptional virtue, heroes, kings who had ruled justly, those who had been specially favored by the gods. The early references to Elysium in Homer's works describe it in language of almost paradisiacal beauty. Elysium was located, according to most accounts, at the ends of the earth, at the edges of the known world, sometimes said to be on distant islands in the ocean, sometimes imagined as existing in a separate dimension altogether. The key characteristic of Elysium was that it was entirely removed from the suffering, the decay, the toil that characterized the living world and even the gray existence of the asphodel meadows. In Elysium, there was eternal spring. The sun always shone, but never burned. The weather was always perfect. The fields were always green and blooming. There was no sickness, no old age, no death, no disease. The dead who dwelt there existed in perfect health and perfect peace. They could remember their lives on earth, unlike the inhabitants of Asphodel who drank from Lethe and forgot, and in that remembrance they could find satisfaction, knowing that they had lived well and earned their reward. What's interesting about the Greek description of Elysium is that it's not described in terms of spiritual transcendence or communion with the divine. The inhabitants of Elysium seem to enjoy very physical pleasures. They ate, they drank, they celebrated. They engaged in athletic competitions and games. They enjoyed music and entertainment. Elysium wasn't a realm of pure spirit, but a realm where the body and its pleasures existed without decay or pain. It was the ultimate luxury, to have all the joys of life without any of its suffering. Not everyone could reach Elysium. Generally, it was understood that exceptional virtue was required, the virtue of heroes, of kings who had ruled justly, of those who had lived with extraordinary courage and honor. Some sources suggested that those who had been favored by the gods during their lives, those who had received divine blessings or who had had divine parentage, might have a better chance of reaching Elysium. There were also mystery religions, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries, that promised their initiates a better afterlife. And some interpretations suggest that the initiates of these mysteries would find themselves in Elysium or something like it, rather than in the gray Asphodel meadows. One important note: Elysium was not a place of idleness or of floating in clouds in some ethereal state. The inhabitants remained conscious and active. They continued to be themselves, but they existed in conditions of perfect virtue and perfect reward. It was a kind of idealization of human life, a state where all the difficulties that made life on earth a struggle were removed, but where human consciousness and human activity continued. You were still you in Elysium, but you were you without suffering, you without failure, you without the exhaustion of struggle. What this meant was that the Greeks didn't conceive of the afterlife, even the good afterlife, as a kind of dissolution or escape from individuality. Even in death, you remained yourself. Even in the underworld, you remained conscious. Even in Elysium, surrounded by eternal peace and pleasure, you were still an individual person with memory, with personality, with the capacity to feel and think and remember. This is a crucial point for understanding Greek thought. The afterlife wasn't an escape from being yourself. It was an eternal continuation of being yourself, either in the terrible case of Tartarus, or the blessed case of Elysium, or the gray case of Asphodel. There was also an important subset of Elysium, or a related afterlife realm called the Isles of the Blessed, where certain heroes might find themselves, sometimes living multiple lives, sometimes being reborn to try again, sometimes remaining in a state of perfect reward. The warrior who died bravely in battle, the hero who had completed great deeds, the king who had ruled justly, these found themselves in Elysium with recognition and honor, their earthly deeds remembered and celebrated eternally. If we could imagine the underworld as a kind of city of the dead, then Asphodel Meadows would be the vast majority district where ordinary people lived out their eternal existence. Not the glorious heights where heroes dwelt in Elysium, not the terrible pits where the wicked suffered in Tartarus, but the great gray plain in between where the vast majority of human souls, neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally bad, simply ordinary, would wander eternally in a state that was neither rewarded nor punished, but simply was. The asphodel meadows were described in remarkably gray, dull terms. Asphodel is a flower, a pale, yellowish-white bloom that grows in Mediterranean regions, and the choice of this flower to describe the plains of the dead seems deliberately chosen to evoke a sense of paleness, of washed-out color, of beauty that is muted and gray. The meadows themselves were not terrible, but they were not wonderful either. They were simply vast, endless plains where the shades of the dead wandered, talking to one another, remembering their lives, but in a way that was muted and without passion. Homer's description of these meadows, spoken by the ghost of Achilles when Odysseus visits the underworld in the Odyssey, is perhaps the most poignant expression of what it meant to be an asphodel. Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War, tells Odysseus that he would rather be a living slave on earth than a king in the realm of the dead. The implication is clear. Even the greatest glory in the underworld cannot compare to the simple experience of being alive, of feeling the warmth of the sun, of tasting food, of experiencing sensation and growth and change. The underworld, no matter how peaceful or how glorified one's status might be, is fundamentally separated from life, and that separation itself is a kind of loss. In the asphodel meadows, souls neither drank nor ate in the way the living did. They didn't have hunger or thirst exactly, but they did have a kind of hollow quality to their existence, as if they were shadows of what they had been in life. They could talk to one another. The souls could recognize old friends and acquaintances and converse with them, but without the passion or urgency that marked mortal conversation. They would spend eternity remembering their lives on earth, and for some, that was a comfort, and for others, that was a torment, depending on whether their earthly lives had been happy or miserable. A crucial part of the asphodel experience involved drinking from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. For those souls destined to be reborn, and many Greeks believed in a form of reincarnation where souls would eventually be born again into new bodies, it was necessary to drink from Lethe to forget their past life. The water of Lethe was said to erase memories, to wash away all recollection of previous lives, so that one could begin fresh in a new body. The word Lethe comes from the Greek word for forgetfulness, and the river was also known as the Ameles Potamos, the river of unmindfulness or carelessness. The process of reincarnation in Greek thought wasn't necessarily a form of punishment or reward. It was simply understood as a natural cycle. A soul would complete its time in the underworld, eventually be judged ready for rebirth, drink from Lethe to forget what came before, and then be born again. Some sources suggest that virtuous souls might be born into better circumstances, while wicked souls might be born into worse ones, a kind of karma system where one's next life was shaped by what one had done in previous lives. Other sources suggest that rebirth was random, or that it was determined by other factors like one's horoscope or divine intention. What's remarkable about this conception is that it creates an infinite cycle. Death is not an ending, but a transformation. The dead don't escape into some other realm entirely, but remain somehow connected to the living world through the possibility of being reborn. This would have had enormous psychological implications for the living Greeks. If someone you loved died, you might see a child born years later, and wonder if perhaps your loved one had been reborn in that child. If you wanted to understand why you were born into the circumstances you were born into, you might look to your past lives and wonder what deeds had resulted in this birth. The Asphodel Meadows, then, were less a final destination and more a kind of way station. Some souls would remain there eternally, neither good enough for Elysium nor wicked enough for Tartarus. They would wander those gray fields, remembering, sometimes meeting old friends, sometimes meeting new ones, existing in a state of relative peace, but also in a state of fundamental disconnection from the vitality of life. But other souls would eventually drink from Lethe and move forward to be reborn, carrying no memory of this gray place, but carrying, in some mysterious way, the consequences of their deeds forward into their new lives. In many ways, the Asphodel Meadows represented the realistic Greek understanding that most people were not heroes and not villains. Most people were ordinary, lived reasonably well, made some mistakes, did some good things, and didn't deserve eternal torment nor exceptional reward. The existence of Asphodel acknowledged this reality and provided a place for the ordinary dead, a place that was neither wonderful nor terrible, but simply the continuation of a kind of existence that had been stripped of its pain, but also of its pleasure, its meaning, its texture. For the ancient Greeks, death was never merely a private event. It was a public and communal transition that required proper ritual performance, collective mourning, and ongoing commemoration. The rituals surrounding death and burial were so central to Greek society that to deny someone their proper funeral rites was considered one of the greatest insults possible, a violation of the most basic human dignity. As we see in many Greek plays and myths, including the story of Antigone, the refusal to provide proper burial was treated as a crime against the cosmic order itself. The rituals of death in ancient Greece followed a fairly consistent pattern documented in literature, art, and archaeological evidence. These rituals had three major components: the prothesis, the ekphora, and the interment itself. But each of these stages was laden with meaning and religious significance, and the collective performance of these rituals was understood as essential for the welfare of both the living and the dead. The prothesis was the first stage, beginning immediately after death. The body was washed carefully, anointed with perfumed oils, and dressed in simple white garments. The body was then placed on a high bed, feet facing toward the door, arranged in a position that would receive mourners. For the duration of the prothesis, which could last several days or even longer, the family and friends of the deceased would gather to pay their respects and to mourn. This wasn't silent or private mourning. It was often loud and public, with hired professional mourners joining family members in singing dirges, tearing at their hair, striking their chests, wailing in a dramatic display of grief. This public mourning served multiple functions. It announced to the community that a death had occurred. It allowed the living to express their emotions and their sense of loss. And it helped prepare the deceased for their journey, as the mourning itself was understood to send them off with respect and dignity. The more elaborate the mourning, the greater the honor shown to the dead, and the better equipped the dead person would be for the afterlife. A person mourned by many, celebrated by many, remembered by many, was a person being sent off with strength and clarity into the underworld. During the prothesis, the family would place the obol, the coin that would pay Charon for passage, into the mouth of the dead person, positioned under the tongue or sometimes on the eyes. This was absolutely critical. A dead person without payment could not be ferried across the river Styx, and would be condemned to wander the banks for 100 years. Even the poorest families would make extraordinary efforts to provide this coin because the consequences of not doing so were understood to be truly terrible. The second stage of the funeral ritual was the ekphora, the funeral procession. This typically took place just before dawn, at a time when the sun's light was weak and the boundary between night and day was blurred, a liminal time appropriate for the passage between worlds. The body was placed on a bier or in a coffin and carried by pallbearers or sometimes by a horse-drawn cart. The entire community would gather to participate in the ekphora, walking from the home to the cemetery or to the place of cremation. The procession was led by musicians playing instruments. The mourners continued their public expressions of grief, singing dirges, wailing, creating a soundscape of sorrow that seemed to accompany the dead on their journey. The ekphora served as a public declaration that this person had been a member of the community, had mattered, had warranted this gathering and this ceremony. For the deceased, the ekphora was understood as their first step in their journey to the underworld. Guided by their community, walked by family and friends, their transition to the realm of the dead was being prepared for in the most public and ceremonial way possible. It was as if the community was escorting them to the threshold and preparing them for the ferryman and the judges. The third stage was the interment itself. The body would be either buried in a grave or cremated on a funeral pyre. Both practices were used in different times and places throughout ancient Greece. Whether buried or burned, the remains would be placed in the ground, or the ashes would be collected and placed in an urn, and the grave would be marked with a stele, a grave marker, or with a mound of earth, or with a monumental tomb, depending on the family's wealth and status. What's crucial about this marking of the grave is that it was understood as ensuring the dead would not be forgotten. Immortality, the Greeks understood, came through remembrance. A person was not truly dead as long as someone living remembered them, spoke their name, poured libations at their tomb. The grave marker served as a kind of anchor to memory, a physical object that would cause people to remember the dead person and to make offerings and remembrances in perpetuity. After the burial, the bereaved family would often host a meal, a commemorative feast where those who had attended the funeral would gather to break bread together. This meal served to return the community to the ordinary world after the extraordinary event of death, to restore the broken circle of the community by reassembling it in a shared meal. But it also served to continue the commemoration. Stories would be told about the deceased. Their virtues would be praised. The meal itself was sometimes understood as a continuation of the offerings to the dead. In the days and months after death, the family would continue to pour libations and make offerings at the grave. These offerings could be wine, honey, flowers, food, or other substances. The ritual of pouring libations, spilling liquid on the ground at the tomb, was understood as providing sustenance for the dead in the underworld. Though the dead didn't eat or drink in the physical sense, the symbolism was that you were still caring for them, still remembering them, still maintaining the connection between the living world and the realm of the dead. There was also the ritual of the Anthesteria, a festival held each year in ancient Athens specifically to honor the dead. During this 3-day festival, families would make offerings at the tombs of their ancestors, pour libations, and sometimes attempt to commune with the dead through various spiritual practices. The festival served as an annual renewal of the bonds between living and dead, an acknowledgement that the dead were still part of the community, still deserving of honor and remembrance. The consequences of failing to perform proper funeral rites were understood to be severe. A person who died without proper burial would wander the earth as a restless spirit, unable to rest, unable to move forward to the underworld. They would haunt the living, bringing misfortune and suffering. In the mythological context, we see this repeatedly. Antigone's horror at the idea that her brother's body would be left unburied and would wander eternally. The ghost of Patroclus in the Iliad, appearing to Achilles demanding proper burial. The dead waiting on the shores of the Acheron, unable to cross, when no coins are provided for their passage. The practical implication of all this was that proper funeral rites were not just nice gestures or social customs. They were understood as essential acts that determined the welfare of the dead in the afterlife. A family that failed to bury their dead properly, a community that denied someone their funeral rites, was committing a profound injustice that had cosmic consequences. This understanding would have strongly reinforced social bonds and communal responsibility. Everyone in Greek society had a vested interest in ensuring that the dead were treated properly, because everyone expected that they themselves would eventually need such treatment. Among all the religious practices and beliefs of ancient Greece, few were more important or more mysterious than the Eleusinian mysteries. These were secret initiatory rites held annually in the sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis, a town near Athens, and they have been called the most famous of all the secret religious rites of the ancient Greek world. The specifics of what happened during the mysteries are unknown to this day. Initiates were forbidden on pain of death from revealing the secrets of the rites. But enough information has survived to give us a sense of their significance and their central promise. The mysteries were rooted in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and they seem to involve a reenactment or symbolic representation of Persephone's abduction, Demeter's grief, and Persephone's eventual restoration. The core promise of the mysteries was that those who were initiated would be relieved of their fear of death. After participating in the secret rites, initiates apparently gained some kind of assurance or hope that their afterlife would be better, that they would escape the ordinary gray existence of asphodel and either approach something like Elysium or at least have some kind of special status in the underworld. The festival would begin with a procession from Athens to Eleusis, following a road that came to be known as the Sacred Way. Thousands of people would participate in this procession, not all of them wealthy or of high status, but a broad cross-section of Greek society, including women and slaves. The procession itself was a significant ritual, marking the transition from the ordinary world to the sacred space of Eleusis. Along the way, there would be various ritual stops and ceremonies. Upon arrival at Eleusis, the initiates would enter the telesterion, the hall of initiation, a sacred space where the secret rites would be performed. Various sources give us tantalizing hints about what might have happened there. Something was recited, perhaps the sacred story of Demeter and Persephone. Something was revealed, perhaps sacred objects or sacred symbols. Something was performed, perhaps a symbolic reenactment or dramatic presentation. Initiates apparently consumed something called kykion, a drink of grain, water, and herbs, which some scholars have suggested might have contained psychoactive compounds that would induce altered states of consciousness. The result of the initiation was described as a kind of revelation, a direct experience of the divine that transformed one's understanding of life and death. Initiates spoke of being relieved from fear, of having hope for the afterlife, of feeling a connection to the divine that transcended ordinary understanding. The Christian writer Cicero, himself an initiate of the mysteries, wrote that they had taught him how to live well and how to die willingly, suggesting that the mysteries offered some kind of spiritual wisdom that addressed the fundamental human anxieties about mortality and meaning. It's important to note that the mysteries didn't promise heaven or escape from the underworld. They promised a better experience within the underworld, a special status, a kind of spiritual development that would continue even after death. The initiates believed that they had entered into a special relationship with Demeter and Persephone, that the goddesses themselves knew them and would look after them in the underworld. The mysteries promised not magical escape from death, but spiritual transformation that would affect how one experienced the afterlife. The mysteries were not open to everyone. There was an initiation process that had to be undergone, and only those who had been properly initiated could participate in the greater mysteries. There were also lesser mysteries held earlier in the year for those seeking to be prepared for the greater mysteries. Women, slaves, and foreigners could participate, though there were restrictions on who was eligible. But once one had been initiated, one would carry the knowledge and the connection with the goddesses for the rest of one's life, and that knowledge was believed to offer real comfort and real spiritual transformation. In many ways, the Eleusinian mysteries represented an alternative or supplement to the official state religious practices regarding the afterlife. While the official religion taught that the dead would be judged and assigned to their appropriate realms, Elysium, Asphodel, or Tartarus, the mysteries seemed to offer an additional promise or hope, a special pathway that transcended the ordinary workings of death and judgment. This special pathway was reserved for those who had sought it out, who had traveled to Eleusis, who had undergone initiation, and who carried the secret knowledge of the goddesses. The fact that the mysteries persisted for nearly 2,000 years, from around the 15th or 14th century BCE until the 4th century CE when Christian emperors shut down pagan temples, speaks to their importance in Greek and later Greco-Roman society. Even kings and philosophers sought initiation. The promise of special knowledge about death and the afterlife was so compelling that it drew people across distances, across social boundaries, across time itself. While Hades and Persephone ruled the underworld, while the three judges administered justice, while the dead wandered in their vast meadows or suffered in their pits, they were not alone. The underworld was populated with various divine and semi-divine beings who played specific roles in maintaining the realm and facilitating the passage of the dead. Thanatos, the personification of death itself, was the brother of Hypnos, the god of sleep, both children of Nyx, the goddess of night. Where Hypnos brought peaceful sleep without pain, Thanatos brought death, the final separation of the psyche from the body. But Thanatos was not cruel or sadistic. He was portrayed as a relatively calm, almost gentle figure, approaching mortals when their time had come and carrying them off to the underworld. He was the messenger of death, the one who came to collect the soul when the fates had decided that the thread of life should be cut. In myths, Thanatos sometimes appears as a figure one could negotiate with or even resist through cunning or bravery, as when Heracles wrestled Thanatos to save the life of Alcestis. But in general, his role was to be the inevitable enforcer of mortality, appearing when the time came and accepting no excuses or arguments. Hermes, the messenger god, also played a crucial role as Hermes Psychopompos, Hermes, the guide of souls. While Thanatos brought death, Hermes guided the newly dead from the upper world to the underworld, leading them to Charon, and the river Acheron, helping them navigate their first steps into the realm of the dead. Hermes was a versatile deity who could move between worlds, who was comfortable in both the upper world of the gods and the lower world of the dead, and his role as soul guide made sense given his general function as a messenger and transporter. There were also the Furies, also called the Erinyes, terrible female deities who dwelt in the underworld and who pursued oath-breakers and murderers, particularly those who had killed family members. The Furies were depicted as ancient, winged female figures with serpentine hair and angry expressions. They were relentless enforcers of the cosmic law that certain crimes, particularly murder of kin and breaking of sacred oaths, demanded punishment. While most of their hunting happened in the upper world, pursuing wrongdoers during their lives, they were also understood as being connected to Tartarus and the punishments that awaited the wicked. There were also various minor spirits and demons that inhabited the underworld. The Keres were spirits of violent death and slaughter, distinct from Thanatos, who represented peaceful death. There were spirits of hunger, of madness, of disease, all existing in the underworld or at its boundaries. And there were the shades of the dead themselves, the psyche that populated the underworld, wandering the asphodel meadows, or suffering in Tartarus, or blessed in Elysium. What all these beings had in common was that they served functions within the cosmic order. None of them were evil in the Christian sense of being opposed to good or rebellious against divine order. They were all part of the system, parts of the machinery of the cosmos that ensured that justice was maintained, that the living and dead were kept separate, that the rules governing existence were enforced. The underworld, in the Greek conception, wasn't a realm of chaos or of rebellion against order. It was a realm where order was maintained perfectly, where the rules never changed and never failed, where every being played its appointed role. If the underworld was truly impenetrable, if Cerberus was truly an uncrossable barrier, if Charon truly would not ferry the living across the river Styx, then how were there stories of heroes who journeyed to the underworld and returned? The answer reveals something important about Greek mythological thinking. The rules applied to ordinary mortals, but those with exceptional courage, beauty, or divine favor could sometimes break through those rules through cunning, music, or the mercy of the underworld rulers themselves. The most famous of these journeys is that of Orpheus, the musician whose song was so beautiful that it could charm even inanimate objects. When his wife Eurydice died from a snakebite, or in some versions was taken by Hades, because he had fallen in love with her beauty, Orpheus could not accept her loss. He traveled to the underworld, his lyre in hand, and made his way through Cerberus, who was soothed by his music, to the throne of Hades and Persephone. There he sang a song so beautiful and so moving that both the god of the dead and the queen of the underworld wept. The story goes that they had never heard anything like it, had never been touched by emotion in such a profound way, and they were moved to grant his request, that Eurydice be allowed to return to the living world. But there was a condition, a law that Orpheus must obey. He could walk ahead of Eurydice back to the upper world, but he could not look back to see if she was following. He must have absolute faith that she was there behind him. If he looked back even once, the permission would be revoked and she would be lost to him forever. Orpheus accepted these terms and began his journey back. He climbed through the underworld, his heart filled with both hope and fear. And as he approached the border between the underworld and the upper world, as he could see the light beginning to break through the darkness above, doubt seized him. Was she really there? Had he been tricked? Unable to endure another moment without knowing, he turned and looked back. Eurydice was there, but in that moment of looking back, she faded. The permission was revoked, and she was drawn back into the underworld forever. The Orpheus story teaches several important lessons about Greek beliefs regarding the underworld. First, it shows that the rulers of the underworld could be moved by beauty and emotion, that they were not purely mechanical enforcers of law, but had the capacity for mercy. Second, it shows that even when mercy is granted, the laws of the underworld remain in effect. Persephone cannot simply give Eurydice back permanently. She can only grant a temporary reprieve under specific conditions. Third, it suggests that the boundary between the underworld and the living world is almost physically present, that one can approach it, that one can nearly cross it, but that crossing requires faith and obedience to mysterious laws. And finally, it suggests that even with all of Orpheus's talent and beauty, even with the favor of the gods, love may not be enough to overcome death. The message is somewhat tragic. The underworld always wins, and the dead, once taken, are rarely returned fully to life. Then there is the story of Heracles, the greatest of all the Greek heroes, who descended into the underworld as one of his 12 labors. Heracles' 12th labor was to capture Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, and bring him to the surface world. Unlike Orpheus, Heracles didn't sneak into the underworld through music and charm. He approached Hades and Persephone directly and asked permission to take Cerberus. The rulers of the underworld, recognizing Heracles as one of Zeus's sons and respecting his great power, agreed, but only on the condition that he subdue the hound without using any weapons, conquering the beast through strength alone. So Heracles fought with Cerberus, wrestling the mighty three-headed beast in a battle that seemed impossible. But Heracles was supernaturally strong, the strongest mortal who ever lived, and eventually he subdued the hound. He dragged the snarling, snapping Cerberus to the surface, showed him to those who had doubted him, and then, in a show of respect for the laws of the underworld, he brought Cerberus back to the realm of Hades. The story suggests that even the greatest hero cannot simply take from the underworld what he wishes. There are laws that must be respected, conditions that must be met, even for those as powerful as Heracles. Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey, made a journey to the underworld, though one that was less physical and more spiritual than Heracles' descent. On the advice of the goddess Circe, Odysseus sailed to the land at the edge of the world where the river Oceanus flowed, and there, using magical rites, he summoned the spirits of the dead. He poured libations and made sacrifices, and through these rituals, he was able to speak to the ghosts of those who had died before him, including the blind prophet Tiresias, who gave him guidance for the rest of his journey, and Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes at Troy. When Odysseus spoke to Achilles, he offered him compliments, suggesting that Achilles was honored even in death, that his fame lived on in the memories of the living. But Achilles' response was melancholic and revealing. He would rather be alive as the lowest slave than dead and honored as the greatest hero. The implication is clear. The afterlife, even for the greatest heroes, cannot compare to life itself. The underworld, no matter how just or how organized, remains a separation from the world of the living, and that separation itself is a fundamental loss. The stories of heroes journeying to the underworld reveal several truths about Greek beliefs. First, they suggest that the underworld was understood as a real place, a place that could theoretically be visited and returned from, even if such journeys were rare and difficult. Second, they suggest that the laws of the underworld, while firm, could sometimes be bent or suspended under special circumstances, for beauty, for courage, for divine favor. Third, they suggest that the rulers of the underworld, while stern, were not irredeemable tyrants. They had the capacity for mercy, for respect, for recognition of exceptional worthiness. But finally, all these stories suggest the same conclusion. The dead are ultimately lost to the living, and all journeys to the underworld, while they might temporarily cross the boundary, ultimately confirm the finality of death and the permanence of the separation between the living world and the realm of the dead. The ancient Greeks, living in a world without the modern comfort of scientific understanding of death, without the consolations of modern medicine that can postpone death, or modern communication that can preserve a sense of presence across distances, built an elaborate philosophical and religious system for understanding death. They imagined the underworld in intricate detail, created judges to ensure justice, populated it with beings who enforced the laws, and created rituals that allowed the living to maintain connection with the dead through memory and offering. They acknowledged that death was inevitable, that it was universal, that it came to all humans regardless of their status or their merit. But they also insisted that death was not meaningless, that justice continued after death, that the dead were not forgotten as long as the living remembered them. And they told stories, stories of heroes who journeyed to the underworld, of souls being judged, of the wicked suffering for their crimes and the virtuous being rewarded for their goodness. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were a way of processing the fundamental anxieties about mortality that haunted human consciousness, a way of insisting that the universe operated according to principle rather than chaos, that deeds mattered, that justice was real even if it was delayed until after death. The Greek underworld, as we have journeyed through it in our mind's eye this evening, emerges as a place of extraordinary philosophical sophistication. It was not a place of random torment or of arbitrary punishment. It was a realm where justice operated perfectly, where the consequences of one's deeds were inevitable, where every soul received exactly what it deserved based on how it had lived. In imagining this underworld, the Greeks were essentially creating a vision of perfect moral order, a cosmic principle that ensured that the universe was fundamentally just, even when the injustices of the living world might suggest otherwise. As we sit here in the darkness, contemplating the journey that we all must eventually make, we can perhaps understand why the ancient Greeks found such comfort in these beliefs. Death is the one certain fact of existence, the one thing that no amount of power or wealth or cleverness can ultimately escape or postpone indefinitely. The Greeks acknowledged this with clear-eyed realism. But they also insisted that the journey beyond death was not the end of meaning, not the end of consequence, not the end of oneself. Instead, it was a transition to another realm where the principles that governed the living world would continue to operate, where justice would be served, where the dead would continue to exist as themselves, conscious, remembering, aware of what they had been. The river Styx continues to flow. Cerberus still guards the gates. Charon still waits for his coin. The judges still weigh the deeds of the dead. And somewhere in that vast underworld, the shades of millions upon millions of humans continue their eternal journey, each one receiving exactly what their life has earned them. That was the Greek vision of death, a vision born from careful thought about justice, about the human need for meaning, about the hope that the universe operated according to principles rather than accident. Tonight, let the idea of the underworld rest with you as you drift towards sleep. Think of that journey that awaits, of standing before the judges, of having your deeds weighed and measured. Let it remind you that how you live matters, that your choices have consequences that extend even beyond death. And perhaps, like the ancient Greeks, you will find in that thought not terror, but a kind of comfort, the comfort of knowing that the universe is just, that meaning is real, that we are not simply insignificant specks in a meaningless void, but participants in a cosmic order where justice, ultimately, is served. Rest well, and remember, we are all destined for that distant shore. But until that time comes, we still have the gift of life, the opportunity to live justly, to be remembered well, and to prepare ourselves for the journey ahead.